Dobar dan svima i hvala vam što ste došli. Izvinjavam se na ovom pomeranju termina. Hvala vam na razumevanju zbog toga i hvala vam što ste prihvatili tu izmenu u kratkom roku. Veliko nam je zadovoljstvo danas da ugostimo gospodina Thomasa Kleina Brockoffa, podpredsednika Nemačkog Maršalovog fonda i stručnjaka za pitanje regionalne politike Evropske unije, transatlantskih odnosa, spoljne politike, nemačke i evropske integracije. On će danas održati prvo jedno kratko uvodno izlaganje koje ćete posle naše kolege stručnjaci za ovim četvrtastim stolom, nije okrugli sto, komentarisati. Predavanje je Germany and the Fraying West, predavanje, odnosno okvir za razgovor današnji. Ja samo hoću da kažem da je ovaj seminar se odigrava u okviru jednog ciklusa razgovora o Evropi koje mi od 2014. realizujemo zajedno sa fondacijom Heinrich Böll i koji se uglavnom realizuju kroz ovakve slične seminare i potom kroz predavanja, tako da će večeras biti predavanje na istu temu u galeriji Artket u 7:30, tako da vas toplo pozivam da dođete i na to predavanje. Naši učesnici seminara su kolege sa ovog instituta i kolege sa Fakulteta političkih nauka i Instituta za evropske studije, Milena Grutinović, naučni saradnik sa Instituta za evropske studije, Milan Krstić, koji predaje na međunarodnim odnosima na Fakultetu političkih nauka, i sa našeg instituta Đurđe Trajković, Aleksandar Pavlović, Marijan Ivković i Srđan Prodanović. Welcome and thank you very much for being here. It's really a pleasure and honor. I've just presented our seminar participants and I've briefly explained the format of the seminar. So our guest and you will now present short theses or arguments under the title Germany and the Fraying West, and then we will hear some comments and questions regarding the subject matter, and you will have an opportunity to comment back. So hopefully we will have a very fruitful discussion that will follow. And also, again, I'm inviting you all to come tonight to Artget Gallery at 7:30 to hear a lecture on Germany and the Fraying West. Without further ado, welcome again and thank you again for being here. The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, and I'm a little humbled here being at a full-blown academic institution together with people who do real work in real science. I'm actually not that type of person, so I'm just a practicing civil society guy who has a little bit of experience in practical political work. So my perspective will be a little more hands-on, rolling up sleeves, and coming from the dirt and the mud of the practitioners' world, not that of the theoreticians. So what I want to talk about in the next few minutes is a debate that is happening in several of our countries, certainly in my country, currently, that has practical consequences. And I want to talk about the debate and the consequences. A number of relevant participants in our public discourse in some of our countries discuss the fact that the West is ending, and they see evidence to that thesis. We all know that evidence, I don't have to repeat it. And so I'm going to start out by asking that question, whether the West is coming to an end. I've, over the course of my professional career, seen many articles, multiple essays written on it over decades. So the debate is nothing new. The question is it finally happening today? Yes, it is true, one would have to say that we do live in turbulent times. There are challenges to the West, and there are challenges to the order that it built post-war. There are symptoms of a crisis of trust, serious symptoms, I would say. They respond to the critics respond to the idea of globalization with the idea of protectionism. They respond to overall internationalism with the perspective of isolationism. And they respond to diversity with a call for national homogeneity. So I would say this, that the liberal international order that we've been becoming accustomed to in the last several decades, with its foundation in multilateralism, in global norms, in a set of values, with its open societies, its open markets, that order is clearly being challenged. It's being challenged from multiple directions, from the inside and the outside of that order. And when talking with you as a German citizen, it is pretty clear that my country is probably one of the more relevant beneficiaries of that order in the last 7 decades. And I would say the security, the affluence, and Germany's status as everybody's best neighbor in the region depends on the existence of that order. The idea that the US, and I'll get to that in more detail, is seeing itself under the current leadership no longer as the prime guardian and protector of that order, is a serious change of strategic outlook to my country, if that ever were to become American policy. That is a dramatic shift of outlook, if it were to come to pass. Germany itself has been seen as something of a sort of has enjoyed a little bit of exceptionalism over the past years. It's not seen the same type of populist movements that countries like France, like Britain, like the United States, like Poland, many other countries like Sweden has seen. At least it hasn't ended up in Parliament. So it was somewhat unaffected by the forces of sovereignism and populism. Now that obviously has ended with the last September election. So we can claim that Germany has normalized in the sense that we also have culturalists and nationalists and xenophobes and some outright racists in Parliament now. The events of this weekend have further normalized the country in an odd respect of the consequences of an increasingly diverse multi-party system. So Germany is in a difficult position itself, but has to be, in order for its own strategic interest, not just be a consumer of liberal order, it has to produce and reproduce West. It hasn't been used to doing that for part of that post-war period, and has only grown more comfortable in being in that role regionally within, I would say, the last 10 years, 10, 15 years. So my country faces several challenges, and I want to focus on 2. So it has to steer, because of its strategic significance to the country, that relationship with the United States during a difficult period of the Trump administration. And it must play a relevant leadership role in helping to repair and stabilize the European Union. I'll get to what I mean by repair. So I think the best way to start is if you look at the question of the West, is to ask the question, what do I see to be the West? What is the West? I think one way to look at the West is to say what it is not. It is not an alliance with a founding document being the Atlantic Charter of 1941, as many people will claim. They say, well, this thing started in 1941 and it ended with Brexit and Trump. That's one theory that I see out there in the Berlin debate that I find amazing. The West isn't an Anglo-American invention. It's not an Anglo-American enterprise. It wasn't founded by Churchill and Roosevelt. It doesn't end with Brexit and Trump. It's also not a geographically defined entity. I follow the sort of thinking of the German historian Heinrich August Winkler, who calls the West a normative project. So a set of ideas rooted in the Enlightenment, norms, values, institutions. On a political level, of course, the first appearance of the West is not 1941 and the Atlantic Charter, but if you want to sort of give a birthright certificate, I would call the Atlantic Revolutions of 1776 and 1789 as that moment, with the Virginia Declaration of Rights and the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens. So the idea of the individual and individual human rights. So essentially it's a set of ideas centered around freedom and equality, the rule of law, and human rights. And that means that the West can be found anywhere. It's in Australia, and arguably Japan is part of the West, although people would be refuting that. So where the protection of human dignity and freedom of the individual have been elevated to a core tenet of state legitimacy, that to me is where I found the West. In the shorthand version, it's the community of free nations. The West has been instrumental in building what we call the liberal international order today. And that, again, is a complicated term. All three elements, the liberal, the international, and the order piece of it, need definition. And there, again, if I want to be sort of broad brush about it, in the context of this conversation, it's a set of rules, norms, alliances, and institutions that have, not initially, but increasingly, been based on the concept of Western democracy. So open markets, multilateralism, international institutions, cooperative security, rule of law, sometimes, as in Europe, shared sovereignty. I would argue that the principle of this type of global citizenship is especially important to smaller and medium-sized countries, because that framework of rights is beneficial to small and medium-sized countries as opposed to large countries who have a set of different tools at their disposal that smaller countries don't. So what happened that I think the West is justifiably called to be in crisis? There is, of course, a number of theories out there. There is the cultural theory of cultural alienation. There is an economic theory of injustice out there. There's a number of other elements out there in the world of explanation of what we're seeing. Many of them have merit, but they have merit to differing degrees in differing countries. I would say that the German populism, the roots of German populism are distinctly different from American roots, so we need to distinguish a little bit here. But I want to draw your attention to one element that of the world of explanation for our phenomenon that is less often used and less often out there. and that is liberal overreach, the overreach of the liberal system itself. So after 1989, the Fukuyama theory of the end of history led, in my view, to the belief system that the liberal democracy would be the be-all and end-all of all of our governance. That is actually, we have a document in which that is enshrined, which is the Paris Charter, 1990, in which 32 countries, including, by the way, was one of the last documents that the Soviet Union signed as a nation. Yugoslavia signed it, in which democracy, representative democracy, would be the only form of governance in Europe in the future. So I think one of the fallacies of the post-1990 period is a nearly teleological belief in the march of history, in which sort of market capitalism accompanied by maturing middle classes would develop in authoritarian countries, and liberal democracy somehow would follow suit. That's essentially our continuing theory about the transformation of China, of any American government since the opening of China in 1973. It has been a theory of a transformation of Russia by many. And so the theory is that in the end, Russia and China would become part of the open order, and so would everybody else. Now that clearly hasn't happened, and for those who think it will happen, I will want to challenge them by asking them whether their analysis is based on whether it's an analysis or it's a wish. There is one quote that I've come across that I much like from a German historian, Andreas Schröder, that we are confronted now with the ruins of our expectations. So our expectations were far-reaching. Some would say it was optimism, others would say it was naive optimism. Others would say optimism has turned into hubris. And what do I mean by hubris? I would say that in the self-assuredness of the liberal model march to global victory, there have been too many people and too many actors who've found themselves emboldened to take shortcuts, to act in the belief that the destiny of our road forward was predefined anyway, and you didn't need to do all the hard work that is necessary to get from here to there. That it was no longer important to actually strive, fight for, and exemplify those norms and values that purportedly we tend to believe in. So, in my view, there were people in the 90s and in the 2000s that saw the dangers. They warned against, and I'll just give you a very short list of things where one wonders from today's perspective. So we used to believe in a self-balancing global financial market. Well, that led us into a financial crisis. That led us to the belief that a global financial market actually does need some regulation. In Europe, we allowed ourselves to start a currency union without a political decision-making center. We believed in the idea of free trade globally without seeing that there's losers to this equation. We had a system that allowed for migration without taking care of outside borders. We had a Schengen system that had one part of the domestic free free movements of people without taking care of the other part of the Schengen Agreement. So we understood the systemic problem, but in our belief of the historic march forward, that didn't seem to be necessary to enact. And by the way, I also believe that in my country and in other countries, the idea that you can have security without adequate defense spending is part of that pie in the sky type thinking that we've applied. So we had a financial crisis, we had a euro crisis, we had a migration crisis. By the way, now we have a global tax evasion crisis that will fuel this sentiment yet anew. And also, just a side remark, these things will fuel right-wing and left-wing populism. I think the tax evasion thing clearly caters to the left wing of this. So the consequence of all of this is that segments of our societies doubt freedoms now. Freedom like the free movement of people, free trade, free financial flows, common currency. All of those things have been cast into doubt, and we're now confronted with solid anti-internationalist, nativist, nationalist movements in multiple countries. Now, get back to the US question in all of this. For a country like mine that is so dependent on the idea of that order, I always call it onion rings that this order creates around Germany. The European Union is the first one, NATO is the second onion ring. The UN system with its multilateralism is sort of the third onion ring of that system. So the idea that an American president has joined that movement is a shock to the system. Germany itself is a late nation. People usually associate that with its formation as a nation state in the 19th century, but it's also a late internationalist. It has contributed to the Enlightenment ideas of democracy, but has also resisted them from the very top until 1945. So the late internationalist, in which internationalism and the liberal order itself was part of its, first its rehabilitation, its reintegration into the global system, the European system and the global system post-45. To all of that, the US was the midwife. Its Europeanization, its unification, its protection until today, its affluence, all of that is in no small part due to that American system of reassurance, including of other European countries about the role of Germany in Europe. So to see the United States, through its president, question some of these things is, again, a shock to the system. To Germans, I think the German question of a country that is too big to be one of many and too small to run Europe, we've seen the consequences of that idea for a couple of times. This system of this order, starting with the European Union, but including NATO and the UN system, is the first time that the German question has been solved. And I want to be very clear and very simple. For the German question to remain closed, Europe has to stay open. And the European system has to remain open. And for that to happen, I have always understood the United States to be the reassurer of last resort. Now, again, under President Trump, that is unclear. And I don't need to go into the details. You all know them from the questioning of, and if you look at the global order, the economic order, the trade order, the non-proliferation order, You just go through the things, everything that has an abbreviation, an acronym, and smacks like international integration is a problem to Mr. Trump. The theorist of the liberal international order, John Eikenberry, calls what Mr. Trump does the sabotage of the liberal international order. So, we are seeing challenges from within. We're seeing this order being challenged by other great powers from the outside, and that to me is rising powers, and it is authoritarian powers, China and Russia. They would like to see the world organized differently. They would like to see the world organized around several centers of power. They would like to see zones of influence. They would like to integrate vertically, which is, if you're an ally to China, then the supremacy of China needs to be accepted, same in Russia. The liberal international order tends to integrate horizontally as a free association of equal states. Now, as I mentioned, for small and medium-sized countries, and I would venture Germany is a small or medium-sized country probably on a global scale, that is as detrimental as for all small states. I would venture to put Serbia into that category. So the idea of being at the mercy of great powers dominating a global system and a West that has rather a horizontal integration system is a challenge. Now, if you think you are being frustrated through my presentation, before we get into, the room is black anyway, which we get into a doom and gloom atmosphere, let's sort of switch the perspective and look at the upside and the adaptation that I think we're seeing. So I don't think the liberal international order is something set in stone that can't adapt. I do believe it can adapt. And by the way, the idea that there is competing models of world order is nothing new. In fact, this liberal post-war order started as a competition between different sets of order. There was the Warsaw Pact as a different, by the way, also a universalist with a universalist aspiration, a different world order in which this order developed in competition. I would argue it even helped the cohesion of the West to have a competing system out there. So as long as you don't think of an international system as something that has to be unitary and global, I don't see the idea that there is authoritarian models of order that work along a multipolar system as a threat to the system. It just, the reach of the system is going to be limited. And then secondly, the second argument would be the liberal world order before 1990 has been less liberal. The idea that democracy is the be-all end-all is a post-1990 development. Before that, it in some ways has been more Westphalian. It has been more rules-based. So I think as long as we don't slide into an anarchy in which people do not accept rules, there can be a cooperation in sets of order between differing people that are coming from different sets of values in this. So as long as we accept that the liberal order will have liberal elements and have others that are less liberal but still rules-based, I think we're not seeing the demise of this order. My second argument, first of all, so I don't see that order collapsing. Second is, I see that the liberal democracies can and will and are on the way of renewing themselves. First of all, I think one of the beauties of democracy is its ability to self-correction. I think there's no other system globally that we have seen in history that is equal in its skill in adapting. Now the downside of it, it usually takes a hell of a long time. Democracies are small and populations tend to be impatient. So the time is of the essence here, but democracies can and will change. So we do understand, I think we have understood as Western countries, and we know that financial markets can be regulated, that globalization can be shaped, that currency zones can be governed, that migration can be controlled, that defense and security can be achieved. So when you then look at what has been done in all of that to address concerns, and essentially what I'm saying is that these people who go populist aren't just crazy people out there. They actually, in my view, look at real concerns, except that I don't share their solutions. So that one needs to take seriously the analyses about problems that they actually put to us. So I think what has been done, I think since 2008, since the financial market crisis, we're looking at a larger movement of regulating financial market. Since 2011, we're seeing the lack of governance in the Eurozone being addressed. Since 2014, I think we're in the West starting to take defense, in Western Europe that is, take defense more seriously. Since 2015, and by the way, you can associate external shock events to all of these. It's clearly Russia and Crimea was the 2014 event. The migration crisis in 2015, I think, has put a completely different focus on Europe's external borders and the control system. Are we finished with that process? No. Is it underway? Yes. So, and the latest of those things is addressing the topic of free trade and fair trade. So I would say there is a movement of reform out there underway, too slow, too piecemeal, but on a broad scale. Now, back to my country, to Germany. Clearly, Germany is and has to be an anchor of liberal order within Europe. It has a regional role. It doesn't have a global role. Too small for that global role, but it has a regional role. So the next German government, whatever that is, whenever we have it, whoever will lead it, has a couple of things to do in my view. First, it would be help fix the Eurozone, help fix the Schengen zone, help fix the defense issue, and have a view on Brexit. I would even say fixed Brexit, that goes beyond vindictiveness. And I want to say a word about all four of that, and then I think I'm going to be done with what I want to put on the table for you to then hopefully discuss. First, the Eurozone. Yes, we've made progress, but that progress has stalled. I think we're still unprepared for asymmetric shocks of the system. There's one country especially that is too big to fail and too big to bail. That is Italy. It is at 131 or 34% of debt to GDP ratio. It is approaching the next banking crisis. It has a politically unstable situation with an election coming up and anti-European and anti-populist forces clearly having a word to say about all of that. And we have a monetary policy of the European Central Bank that is accommodating and is creating some of the growth that we're seeing, by the way, for the first time in all Eurozone countries since inception of the euro at this stage. So the Eurozone reforms, the European stability mechanism, the completion of the banking union, all of that to me is essential to what a German agenda for stabilization of Europe needs to entail. The fixing of the Schengen zone is the second sort of systemic challenge to the European Union. Clearly the Dublin system is broken, and therefore one of the great achievements of Europe, which is the Schengen zone, is in danger. So from a German perspective, I would have wished on Sunday to have seen a government that as one of its main goals is to reform the German refugee and migration system and be able to project towards especially our Central and Eastern European partners a realistic approach to migration that will allow a more trustful atmosphere in order to fix the Schengen zone. I can't tell you what that German position will look like now. That's all in doubt. But it is a precondition for making progress on Schengen. Third issue, clearly Europe must do more, the European Union and the NATO members inside the Europe must do more on defense. And it's clear that with regard to American uncertainty with vis-à-vis NATO, it has to strengthen the European pillar of NATO. PESCO, the permanent structured cooperation, is just the first step, but this is a larger package of taking care of an issue that we have clearly not addressed in the past 20 years and didn't need to address, by the way. And finally, fixing Brexit. And I say fixing Brexit because if Brexit is an exercise in vindictiveness, then we're taking Europe into the wrong direction. We will need a Great Britain that is a friend of the European Union, and we will need a sense of Europeanness even if you're not a European Union member. Right now, only small countries, Switzerland, Norway, had that, but if Great Britain it has a relationship with Europe that is sound and close, it might be a good example for other European nations, including larger nations. I'm thinking of Ukraine and Turkey at this point, depending on how they're governed, that you have a different association with the European Union. When you take my 4 points together, fixing the Eurozone, fixing the Schengen zone, fixing defense, and fixing Brexit, you have a large-scale agenda on repairing and rebuilding trust in Europe. That, I think, is the agenda that any German government in cooperation with its European partner must address. So, and I'm going to skip, I think, the part in which how to deal with Trump and leave that to our conversation here in order not to bore you with too much monologue. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now proceeding. We will now proceed with the second part of the seminar, and it's questions and comments. And I suggest that we take 2 by 2 maybe, and we should go maybe clockwise with 2 Milans. So can I just please ask you to briefly introduce yourselves before asking a question, and please stay within 5 minutes so we can all finish.
Is it on? Yeah. My name is Milan Igutinovic. I work at the Institute of European Studies. I'm a researcher there, a historian by trade, but have been writing extensively on common extensively on common foreign security policy for the last 5 or 6 years. So PESCO has been a nice team for the past few weeks for me. What I was thinking about the topic of today's discussion. Two things which I'm worried about. Trump is one of them, but in a sense that we still don't know what the Trump effect really is. Will we have elections in 2020 when some new centrist or liberal American politician win and that say that Trump is just merely a passing phenomenon, nothing more than that? Because he's not really an effective politician. He has a lot of barriers through American institutions. He is more of a Twitter star than a practicing politician in that term. So Trump is much more a question mark to me than a huge problem at this point. And the second thing is, I've been reading a lot of Ivan Krastev lately for the past year or so. And
we all do, yeah.
Yes, the issue of former Eastern European Soviet bloc states and the reasoning of their own decisions to join the EU in the early 90s or to move on to EU integration steps. Because what he argues, and I find it convincing anyway, is that in difference to the large Western European countries, France, UK, Germany, that have in one way or another had saw the crumbling down of their empires, in one way or the other, colonial empires, inter-European empires, so to speak, whether it was even a Nazi project or a French colonial empire or whatever. They saw the EU integration as a way to adjust their own national sensitivities, issues, economies, and in a way to find a form, a clearinghouse, if you wish, for these sentiments, and to be able to express their own interests in a democratic, liberal, and non-aggressive way. For Eastern European countries, they managed to escape somehow. That's not the topic of today's discussion. They managed to escape what was essentially communist international, and it was a way to reaffirm their own national interest, and probably in a more ethno-nationalist or more conservative way, and which is probably a bedrock of why we see today Kaczynski's government. I'm saying Kaczynski's government because he is the main person behind it. Viktor Orban, they all have sort of roots within this sort of I'm not going to say xenophobia because it's too harsh a word, but probably not so much cosmopolitan look at the world as leading Western powers did when they decided to create the European integration project. So there is I believe there is a clear difference in the reasons why some nations joined the European project, if you will. So the Eastern Europe is something that worries me a bit. So this might be a challenge for the years to come for what you have aptly described as a Western liberal order, the rule of law, the individual rights, not ethno-nationalist based concept of state and society. So these were main. So if you could comment on whether you see Trump as maybe a passing phenomenon more than a new staple of American policy, and how does Germany see this sort of rise of nationalist power, which do support European Union? Vast majority of Hungarians, of Poles, overwhelmingly support the EU as a project, but they probably see it differently than French or Italian or people from Netherlands, if I can compare that anyway. So this might be two more practical issues for the EU. I'm also worried about any sort of Eurozone reform, because any sort of significant reform would require probably a change of treaty. And change of treaty is probably not in the cards in the years to come. It would be very difficult to find any solution that would satisfy all member states, because treaty should be must be changed unanimously and with consensus. So it would be very hard to imagine a new treaty that would be able to satisfy such a different economic interests and worries that are brewing within each member state. PESCO is a hopefully will bring at least defense industries in order to be more efficient, to spend money more efficiently, and to add more money on top of what is already being spent. that should be say a nice and a positive way to reframe the debate on EU security, looking at the eastern borders and the southern borders as well, because the arc of instability, as it said, is present, and it is certainly a positive step forward. And well, Schengen probably relies on the security of external borders. If external borders are safe, the Schengen, the logic behind the Schengen is not really in question. Then the internal borders should be safe and safe and sound. So, how would you mark the actions, the restructuring of Frontex, the Sophia mission in the Mediterranean, and well, let's say closing of the Balkan route? Do you see these steps as positive and as significant in the process of reaffirming Schengen logic that has kept the internal borders open? So 3 questions from me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just briefly introduce myself. I'm Milan Krstić from Faculty of Political Sciences. I work as a teaching assistant at Faculty of Political Sciences, and I teach foreign policy and contemporary Balkan relations, but actually my main research focus is are the United States of America, so I focus on their foreign policy. And basically, the first issue that I would like to tackle is the United States of America, and I would like to sort of build on what my colleague just said, and that is that Trump is, from my perspective as well, I completely agree with him, that he's more some sort of, let's say, Twitter politician than actually a man who will make huge changes in foreign policy of the United States. Of course, it does not mean that he will not affect, generally speaking, the political culture and politics of the United States of America. Of course, he will, and he does it currently. But regarding foreign policy issues, I think that his influence will definitely be not as big as some people thought that it will be earlier. However, I think that we should analyze as well other actors, other foreign policy actors in the United States of America, and their approach towards the European Union. There is some sort of belief, which is based on evidence, that American Congress is one of biggest supporters as an institution of European integration and strong ties between the European Union on the one side and the United States of America on the other side. However, I would just like to mention one example. This year, this summer, American Congress adopted with almost 100% of votes in both houses, a resolution of sanctions, not resolution, it's actually a law, a bill of sanctions against Russian Federation, which had as well possibility to use and to implement sanctions against European or any other third states parties which cooperate with Russia in building pipelines for gas or any other energy source. That means that actually, according to that law, American president has a possibility to implement sanctions against, for example, Nord Stream, German companies which are building Nord Stream 2. I sort of, although afterwards Juncker had conversations, etc., and German reaction was not harsh, but it was, they reacted, and then Americans explained that it's just a possibility, and I suppose that it's actually that they will never use it against Germany, but that they might use it against Hungary or Serbia or Macedonia if we decide to build South Stream project. That it's actually that was the main goal of that law. But that showed that even American Congress and those actors in the United States which are supporters of European integrations, in some aspects have or might have different views towards the necessity of cooperation between Europe and Russia. Is there, from your point of view, a possibility that in future, regardless of Trump, Russia might be a problem especially if some actors in Germany, like liberals or whoever creates a future government, if they put on the agenda issue of softening the sanctions, which was raised during the campaign. That's the first question, and the second...
But the question goes to what's the concern here?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, what's the concern, and what is your projection of, is there some sort of like structural problem for cooperation between Washington, Moscow, and Brussels or Berlin, or only Trump is a problem, and when he goes out, everything will be solved? And just a second, I will just briefly mention one more thing. I was not surprised, but it shows as well. I completely agree with your tasks for Germany, but it is sort of indicative that there is no enlargement of the European Union in those tasks. I would suggest that enlargement, a continuation of enlargement, might be a good solution for the European Union at the moment. But I don't have time to further discuss that issue. But what is your view and your perception of the future of enlargement of the European Union, and should Germany promote fast integration of the Western Balkans to the European Union? Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think this was the first round of questions and comments. To comment back or to answer questions.
Okay. I think I'll take I'll bundle the U.S. in one response and then go through the rest. So. Trump. Now, American visitors to Germany usually tell me, don't look at what we say, look at what we do. To which I tend to say, yep, okay. But words matter. Not Twitter words, but when you look at the speeches, the UN speech, the Warsaw speech, the Da Nang Vietnam speech. I don't even need to go to Twitter. So things, a president sets a tone, he sets policy, he sets direction. Other foreign policy players globally respond to that type of aspiration. So I think words matter. Now, is that a refutation of what both of you said? No, I think it's so yes, I think we haven't seen the full effect of Trump yet. In that he is as you say, an ineffective player. However, he has been very good in the destructive part and very bad at the constructive part. So he's been able to dismantle international agreements, call in doubt international agreements. The Paris Climate Accord is one. The Iran deal is another one. We could look at a January 15 deadline, in which he actually not only decertifies the Iran deal, but then reissues sanctions on Iran. And then Germany, as a participant of the EU 3+3 negotiations and as a signee of the Iran deal, would be put into the question as to whether to uphold the treaty against the United States and to oppose, together with Russia, the sanction regime. So that's, I think, one of the, if you ask around in Berlin, that is a nightmare scenario of the next 6 weeks alone. So where am I going with this in a larger scale? My argument would be that this president consists of two elements. One is his individual nature as Donald Trump, in which I would say he is a president sui generis with regard to the international order. There is no other major player in the American system that would want to run around the global order with a wrecking ball like this president does. All other participants of the political spectrum are different with regard to international integration, with NATO integration, in sort of in the international integration of the United States. Now, does that mean that a change of government, either to another Republican or a Democrat, would mean that some of the tendencies in American society that produced Donald Trump in the first place are going to be gone with Donald Trump? No. So I think what we'd be seeing is a skepticism towards trade that is within the Democratic Party, within the Republican Party, within the American free trade as a global system. The idea that America hasn't benefited from free trade is very popular. So we're going to see a trade skeptic. We're going to see the debate on burden sharing between Europe and the United States will continue. So I think we need to distinguish between specifically Donald Trump issues and continuing skepticism of the American electorate vis-a-vis some of the elements of American participation in order. So we need to be prepared for an America that has a skepticism towards certain elements. But we also have to think about Donald Trump as a sui generis phenomenon. In that sui generis element, I would follow your thought that will be a passing phenomenon. Therefore, a strategy towards the United States, I think, needs to start from the long view. It has to look at, not at Donald Trump, it has to look at what is the relationship we want to have as Germany, as Serbia, as European countries with the United States in the long run, and have our current policy educated by that. And that to me means that we have to distinguish policy areas. I don't think we can deal very well with Donald Trump on some of the core elements of his populist agenda. We need a reformed international refugee regime, on resettlement mechanism, on UNHCR, probably even on the Geneva elements. No way we can get that with Donald Trump. Don't even try, it will make things worse. Do we need a TTIP, a transatlantic trade partnership with Europe? Yeah, we need it, but we can't get it with Donald Trump. And so I would put that into the deep freezer. So I see sort of an area of several areas of policy where I don't think we can deal with Donald Trump. Should we deal on security matters, on cybersecurity, on NATO matters? Clearly in the national interest of all NATO member European countries, and probably beyond NATO members. So security, yes, trade, less so. Should we work on climate policy with the United States? Yes, but probably around Donald Trump, but not with Donald Trump. So my strategy, if I was to devise one, would be looking at what is it that we have to do long-term beyond Donald Trump? What do we have to do with him now? What do we have to do without him? And what do we, by the way, have to do against him? So there's a U.S. strategy, to me, is a complicated beast in the age of Donald Trump. That leads me to piece 2 of your question, which is the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress and Russia. I had a group of 20, a whole 17 of them Republicans, members of the U.S. House of Representatives in Berlin, a couple of months that I had the privilege of speaking with. And they, of course, asked me of why there was such a German opposition to actually what you mentioned, which is the sanctions element. Now, the sanctions element has two different pieces. The first piece is, of course, the idea that sanctions become law and not a regulation, so that the president is actually bound by that law, so that he cannot just with his pen end sanctions with his partner Vladimir Putin. So that was an element to contain Donald Trump. I don't think there is any opposition to containing Donald Trump by U.S. Congress back where I come from. Every containment of him is welcomed. The question is the global reach to third parties of those sanctions. And so congressmen didn't make that distinction. They said, why are you opposing it? I said, Mr. Congressman, this is about national sovereignty. We don't like you to impose sanctions on us. I don't agree with our policy. I'm not a supporter of our Nord Stream policy. I think we should not have Nord Stream. We should end that project. That view is not shared by the governing group, certainly not by the Chancellor. I'm not making that policy. She's making that policy. Does that mean that, you know, I was telling the congressman, let's do our own mistakes here. It is not for you to impose sanctions on us. We should do this jointly. The issue here is Russia and Russia's behavior in Crimea and Ukraine, and not a pipeline project. By the way, that by extension, I would say you could cross out Germany and put Serbia in there, and your argument would be, yeah, the argument would be the same, I think. You tell me whether that's different, but that I would assume that. So your question, are we looking, and your broader question is, are we looking at is it a Donald Trump issue or is it a US issue that we're looking at? I think the indication that we had a nearly unanimous US Congress on both sides, the House and the Senate, shows you that there is a clear distinction in Russia policy between this president and the overwhelming element of the American foreign policy establishment. So you will see a policy that is very, very distant to and critical of Russia. I would expect that the U.S. Congress is actually probably, from a German perspective, too hawkish on Russia before a German taste. The German taste would be, yes, we have imposed sanctions on Russia. Yes, there is an element of principle on the question of borders in Europe, but there needs to be a long-term relationship with Russia. So, that I would put into the basket of elements where there is not a confrontation, but a difference in nuance between the German position and the American position beyond Trump. Okay, then there is the question, and I want to go through it so that I don't give you too much of a monologue yet again here. So let me go through the Ivan Krastev, I'll call it the Ivan question, okay? I think that I think in my country, and that probably includes some other Western European countries, Netherlands and France as well, is that Sweden, the migration crisis has highlighted a difference in sort of a more multi-ethnic versus an ethno-national approach to, by the way, the same set of European Union structures that I think we haven't been aware of to the same degree before the migration crisis. So the migration crisis has an educating quality to it, in which I think we can, and by the way, if you have the Kaczynskis and the Orbáns, I see very little opportunity to find common ground with them on especially these issues. There I see, I don't see how building walls will solve problems. So there, I find their approach is rather extreme. Denying that there is a universalist challenge to the migration and especially the refugee migration is a voluntary thing, but refugee, the idea that you can knock on doors in countries in Europe and have a right to be heard, I think is a civilizational achievement of the post-war order, and that Mr. Orban and Mr. Kaczynski want to call that into question is a very hard thing for me to accept. Now, what I can accept is that we have very different abilities, histories, economic situation, cultural, political backgrounds in which to accommodate these things, so that the result of may be very different in very different European countries, and that clearly we've seen an uncontrolled extreme of a refugee moment in 2015 that I don't think anybody wants to see repeated. So therefore, I think if we can agree on these sort of on the elements of limitations, but on a universalist core, I can see us moving towards practical solutions, even notwithstanding the philosophical divide as you describe it. Does that answer your question in some ways? And that, by the way, gets you to Schengen. I think we've woken up to the idea that that Schengen consists of two parts: domestic movement and external borders. That external borders have to be secured. I think that's motherhood and apple pie now. We're not good enough at implementing it. I would see the securing of external borders as part of enabling the universalist core in the long term. If you don't control your borders, you cannot even, you have no version of deciding who comes in and who comes out. So external borders is, unfortunately, as some people would say, but it is a key element of restabilizing our system. What else do we have?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Maybe we should move on with questions.
Yes.
Because unfortunately, we're very limited with time.
Okay.
We have
all right.
another event at 3. So if you agree, I was going to suggest that maybe we should now collect on 4 interventions, because at 3 we have another event. So maybe if that's okay. Also.
Yeah. So you stop whenever you feel you're tired of this and you feel.
So we'll just go on with 4 more interventions.
Sure. Thank you so much. I just have a quick question. So the problem with homogeneity versus diversity is a complex theoretical problem. I'm not going to get into it. But the question is this: if diversity should have had diminished racism, it didn't do it. We live through enormous racism today in Europe. So my question is, what policy would you have for that?
Policy for
how to combat racism and abolish it.
Okay, my name is Sasha Pavlovic. I work here at the Institute. I'm more involved in Balkan studies, so something concerning Balkan culture. And I would like to ask a question from that perspective. You were very clear in designating certain we, and I don't need to say that.
Designating?
Certain we, the West, liberal democracies, and also, exemplifying the non-we, Russia, China, and everything. And I've been thinking, of course, people here, we don't need to say even explicitly that we subscribe to this, to this we. However, I've been thinking from a broader perspective. Serbia is somehow half-half in the last 15 years or so. And when I listen to you, not just you, I'm thinking, is Serbia part of this we or not? And that's why I would like to try to voice a different a different narrative. What is the non-we that somehow gets silent? And I believe we should take that into consideration. And from this non-we perspective, from this other, let's say, perspective that is equally present, and let's say that that other perspective involves millions and millions of people who are de facto Europeans, but still not part of the European Union, a general narrative, which I will summarize in 2 minutes, would function like this. The moment that Germany reunified, it started pursuing similar foreign policy as the one it led in the past towards the Balkans. That is, it supported vigorously Croatian and Slovenian independence, and therefore, you know, effectively the breakup of Yugoslavia. Then, not such a long time afterward, it also supported the independence of Kosovo, even though Serbia opposed that, trying to use force, but also some legal documents. Then, Germany is against the independence of Crimea, even though Crimea enjoyed as a region certain autonomy, even though there was a referendum at Crimea, even though historically speaking Crimea was not part of Ukraine, and that was connected to Ukraine by a communist decree in mid-1950s. And there was, if I'm not mistaken, also a treaty among the constitutive parts of Soviet Union. When they decided to break up, they had some kind of agreement called the Union of Independent States, making explicit what the constitutive parts are allowed to do and what not to do. In other words, if we split, now things stay the same, but if any of our parts decides to have some kind of a military alliance with other parts, then this agreement is off. Therefore, so I'm not going to push this argument too much further. Question for me in my study, and I believe from a wider perspective, from this, Stiftungs and people who are concerned with this we, is how should we, should we take that into consideration, this other perspective? How would we respond to that? Okay.
Got it.
In different circumstances, I would take more time, but this
I get it.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Marin Ivkovic. I'm also a researcher at this institute, and I'm a sociologist by training, but my primary research area is like social theory, social philosophy, and critical theory, the Frankfurt School, some more recent authors within this tradition. So, when you spoke about the West as a normative project, this was very inspiring for me, and also kind of problematic as well, as you tried to argue that the liberal international order as a project can be saved through certain kinds of adaptation. I would agree with this. I would agree that it's an evolving project, and a project where we don't have any clue a priori how it will continue evolving. But I think we can make some kind of conclusions about we can draw some conclusions about the really problematic and paradoxical nature of the present situation, where Donald Trump might appear as an aberration, but he is a symptom of some deeper problems, I would say. And these deeper problems have to do with a paradox that I would call the fundamental tension between, let's say, liberal political universalism, and on the other side, economic liberalism, and the idea of the global free market. As we are seeing, the crisis of 2008 also was not entirely an aberration. It might be an episode, but it's symptomatic of a deeper process, which is the relative economic decline of the West with respect to non-Western.
You said the global free market versus the
the global free market versus the global political universalism.
Oh, political universalism.
Yes, political liberal universalism. Now, the relative economic decline of the West is what some neo-Marxist economists like Emanuel Wallerstein would call the terminal crisis of global capitalism. It seems quite difficult to reverse it. Now China will become the dominant global economic power in a couple of years, and it's not a liberal nation right now. Now the most fundamental issue here is how to preserve the normative project of Western political universalism in a global condition where the West is no longer economically dominant. I would say the most valuable trait of the normative project of post-1945 Western integration is the welfare state, the social democracy. I think this was by far the most important specific trait of the EU and the West compared to opposing projects. Now, it is this trait that's in danger right now. How to preserve the social democratic welfare state in a global economic free market where the West has to remain competitive against states which have extremely unjust labor laws, which are very, very exploitative of their labor force, like China, like India, and how to rescue the welfare state without giving in to populism and protectionism. I think this paradox is pretty tough to solve and fix, and that my question is, would you agree with this diagnosis? Thanks.
Okay, so my name is Srđan Prodanović. I come also from the same institute, and I'm primarily interested in sociology of everyday life, and my question will reflect in some sense my research focus, but also it will fall close to the question that Marian asked. So one of the implications of the problems you talked about in your interesting lecture is, I think, that we are also witnessing some sort of decline of the so-called notion of soft power within the West. And a huge part of this decline is the loss of horizontality. The people have the feeling that the institutions of representative democracy have lost their ability to represent them, and they are feeling powerless. This is why they give in towards populists. And within your framework that you developed for reforming the European Union, I think that we also have to have some kind of experimentalism with political institutions and forms of representation. And in that sense, I'm interested to hear your opinion about some kind of, I don't know, direct democracy or deliberative democracy as a corrective of this feeling of powerlessness that people evidently have within the European Union, but also in the United States. So that's it. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Boy, you guys don't mess around, right? The type of questions you're throwing at me. I'll try, but you guys, I mean, you're academics and you're giving me hardball questions here. So I'm sorry for if my answers from practitioners aren't satisfying from this institute's level of academic proficiency here. So I think I'll start in reverse order to the other questions. I think the sort of the decline of soft power is the starting point of what I said. That the restoration of that soft power is the agenda, and it's the reason of the crisis of trust that I think we're in. That, you know, it's not so much the challenges from alternative model from the outside, which I said, explain why I think they are manageable. It's the concern from the inside. Now, how to address and how to fix that? My answer, as different from your answer, is to give answers on the substance of those issues. Your suggestion is to adapt the democratic system towards an increasing demand for participation. So I have nothing against participation. Don't get me wrong on this. But I'm starting to be concerned if direct democracy replaces elements of representative democracy. So I think we're seeing that, let's say, referenda, even on, we used to say that it's a good thing to have a referendum on the local level, but if you have it on a national level, then it becomes too complex. Well, I've been witnessing local referenda now for a while that are also so complex that the yes and no in a referenda question that gets you to a direct democracy has no consideration. Let's say you decide, as we did in Berlin, keep an airport open or not open, or built on this area, not on that area. The ripple effects of these decisions are enormous. By the way, you see the Brexit decision as an element of direct democracy. So I'm concerned with the complexity and of these issues that are being dumbed down in referenda type questions. So I don't see the referenda as the solution to that problem. Now, some elements of participation, of deliberation, especially on the local and regional level, I think are valuable, and there are as elements that should be tested, but neither in opposition nor in replacement to the responsibility of the elected official, in my view. Okay, so the question is, so let's call it the Frankfurt School question here, right? Yes, of course, a Marxist and a neo-Marxist will see every crisis within capitalism as a crisis of capitalism, and as its final crisis. Yes, but that was not your question. Your question was far removed from that. And it is the question of how to preserve sort of the welfare state in a double, first of all in a modernization crisis that we're seeing, and second of all in one in which the West has less economic sway. I tend to be an optimist on all of that. I'm not very much of a sort of a declinist alarmist in these things. I think human history shows us the adaptability from the rural society to the industrialization, that we have been able to adapt now with some transformational costs. From rural to industrial, from industrial to post-industrial, we're now looking at what we in Germany call Industry 4.0, the factory without workers, with robots and all of that. We tend to overlook the opportunities in all of these. The value added that is being created by this new economy will be able to, at least that would be my hope or my aspiration, to finance what we call the welfare state today, because the value added will be so enormous that we will be able to deal with these questions. That's at least has to be our aspiration and our hope. Now, between that fundamentally optimistic assessment and today's reality is a lot of societal adaptation, with moving people from up the value chain. I think Western societies, European societies, need to adapt to that reality, need to prepare their populations for that reality. It means that we will have increasingly jobs that need increasing elements of education that I don't think we see. So we will need to upgrade our societies in order to master that challenge. Otherwise, we will run into it. Again, I'm not a pessimist on this. I see the opportunities because we've always so far managed the opportunity. The information age. We've had the same argument about the information age. The information age has created as many jobs as the claim was we would lose by way of computerization. Now we have the robot and 3D economy that we're going into, and we're facing the same argument. Yes, it is a challenge, but we have managed before. Why wouldn't we manage this? So the we and the they. That's I think a very good and a very thoughtful and a very challenging question. First, I wanted to help. I mean, what I see as we and they. I mean, I don't see anybody who's not part of the European Union not as part of the we and the they. It's those people who see themselves on path of this normative project, not anybody who is member of an institution or isn't a member of the institution. By the way, that's not just states. We're talking about individuals here. That's so if you're on path towards a free society of universal norms, I would call that as part of the we. Now, does that mean that? I think what you're looking at with we and they are, am I looking at some sort of global conflict of model? Am I looking at a rerun of the West versus the Warsaw Pact? Is that what your question refers to in the end?
I believe some people here and in other parts have a difficulty perceiving these universal values and norms. And I pinpointed to one example concerning sovereignty, where EU members recognize certain situations
and don't others.
And don't recognize others. And then when it comes to foreign policy in general, you know, NATO members also tend to use force. And again, from this perspective of other people, maybe they don't see this as pursuing universal values and norms, but they see some kind of rather similar situation that all big nations, all big powers pursue their interests in pretty much a similar way. That was my...
No, I mean, my whole argument is about double standards. I think I didn't mention the term double standards, but I think that in this optimism element that went into hubris, there's two directions. One is the overly optimistic, so you can do shortcuts, and the other one is that you engage in double standards because you think you're coming out in the right place anyway. And I don't think the West as such has ever overcome the idea that there is contradictions, that there is sort of the normative and the realist element of power. So we see a tension there, and I would grant you that element. So I don't see the West as a sort of the shining city on the hill that doesn't have these things. But my argument is about striving and trying and repairing and not letting ourselves be drawn into this type of thinking. And I think the populist movements have pointed us to some of the worst contradictions that we've engaged in. So then there was homogeneity, how to combat racism. Oh God, yes. I don't know how. If only I knew. Now, diversity doesn't end prejudice. It surely doesn't. But diversity creates a different reality that ameliorates some of these issues. Now, your argument is that it doesn't. I don't happen to agree with that. I happen to find that that Western metropolises have adapted to a very different approach to ethnicity. Now, I don't expect anybody to all countries and all regions and all people in all countries to accept that urban reality in Amsterdam, London, Paris, Berlin, for that matter. But your argument, turning around your argument, would mean that diversity and racism have nothing to do with each other, right? Isn't that what you're saying, or am I misreading your? That diversity doesn't combat racism.
No, it doesn't. It just maintains it.
It may.
It maintains it, and it doesn't touch upon it, because diversity suggests that we're all going to live together, and respect our differences, but it doesn't change the racist line in our thinking.
And your belief is that a reality doesn't change your approach.
No.
If your neighbor looks different, then that reality doesn't change your mindset.
No, but my neighbor doesn't look differently. The whole point is the point of perception. But it's a structural problem, I think, with diversity. But because of the time, I think we should probably leave it for some other point.
Unfortunately, there won't be any time for further debate, because I was hoping that maybe some other people from the audience could ask some questions. But we have another event coming up at 3 o'clock.
Okay.
So sorry about this, but anyway, thank you. Thank you a lot for your presentation, for your time, for your patience.
Well, I thank you for giving me a hard time here.
You don't mess around as well, so it's a fair bargain.
It's a fair bargain. Okay.
Thank you all for coming, and please come to Art Gallery at 7:30. We'll be hearing more on the same topic. So thank you again very much. Thank you for being our guest.